UFO is the most underrated band in history. Hi, and welcome back to Classic Guitar Rock. I'm Jeremy, and I want to talk about the most underrated band in the history of classic rock, and that, in my mind, is UFO. UFO is one of these bands that I can remember as a kid reading the guitar magazines and always hearing about UFO, but never really hearing them, right? I'd read interviews where people talked about how great UFO was, how great this live album Strangers in the Night was, and Lights Out, and all of this stuff. And then even later on, when Michael Shanker became part of my record collection, I knew he'd been part of UFO, but I still didn't know much about UFO. And then I remember, 20 years ago hearing Rock Bottom, and Doctor, and I thought, well, those are cool. And then Lights Out. And so I always heard these songs, but I just never took the time to go back and do my homework on UFO. And let me just say at the outset, you should absolutely do that. And UFO was obviously a much bigger in Great Britain and in Europe than they were here. But even there, they never reached the heights of, other bands like, Iron Maiden or Judas Priest or Def Leppard or even Status Quo, which Status Quo never hit it big here, but in Europe they were big, which is a shame because UFO really is one of my favorite bands, and I do not understand why they're not mentioned in the same breath with bands like Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple, because in my mind they deserve to be at that level. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about UFO. And by the way, those bands I've mentioned, Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, Judas Priest, Saxon, all of the British bands will cite UFO as a major influence. Randy Rhoads cited Michael Shanker as one of his guitar influences, but they were always orbiting around classic rock, in terms of the big bands of classic rock, but they never were considered one of the big bands of classic rock, which to my mind is a shame when you go back and listen to what they've done. So I just wanted to talk about UFO, and if you're not familiar, consider this an introduction and an invitation to check out the band that I think is the most underrated band in classic rock. So UFO's history starts way back in 1968. We had a singer named Phil Mogg, a bass player named Pete Way, a drummer named Andy Parker, and a guitar player named Mick Bolton, who put out this album called UFO. And it has nothing to do with flying saucers. They got their name from a club in England called the UFO Club. So that's where the name came from. And they put out the first album. If you listen to the first two albums, they really are a lot different than the later stuff. And I'm not dissing those albums, but they're much more psychedelic. Their second album, for instance, is called Flying. And depending on the version of the album you have, one version says 1 hour space rock. Okay. And it's just kind of psychedelic, long form, bluesy jams. And it's kind of cool, but very dated compared to what we later think of as classic UFO. UFO, as we really know it, didn't really start until around 1973, 74, when this young German guitar player named Michael Shanker was snatched away from the Scorpions to join UFO. Now, before that, interesting, Mick Bolton was replaced by a guy named Bernie Marsden, that you might recognize the name. He was in Whitesnake. And in fact, there are demos around of him playing a few of the early UFO songs that we think of as Shanker era songs that actually Bernie played on. But it was really, it was really when Michael Shanker joined the band in, let's see, 1974. And the story goes that UFO was touring and the Scorpions were opening for them in Germany, and they needed a guitar player, and they said, hey, this little Shanker kid is great, let's bring him in. Because Michael was 18 at the time and was already, getting some attention for his guitar playing. And so he comes in, and Michael could hardly speak any English, very little English, if any, at the time. And, I've seen in interviews where it was like, basically they'd go in and he'd show them a riff, or or Pete would have a bass riff, and they'd just start jamming, right? And then they'd just write songs. And for the first few years, he hardly even talked to him. He had a girlfriend that would translate for him sometimes, but for the most part, they didn't talk, right? But they started, rocking out. The first album, and it's one of my favorites. It's not one that people really will cite as their favorite, but I really like Phenomenon, which is the first album with Michael Shanker. Now, interestingly enough, I have another video where I talk about the time when the Rolling Stones considered Michael Shanker to replace Mick Taylor. And on the surface, that seems so crazy, because you think of Michael Shanker with Scorpions, or Michael Shanker Group, where it's melodic rock, borderline heavy metal stuff. That was kind of what, wearing the black leather bomber jacket, that's kind of what we think. But if you listen to Phenomenon and think about the time frame around 74, 75, when the Stones were replacing Mick Taylor, and I can totally see why the Stones were interested in Michael Shanker, because that's a very bluesy album. And some of the songs, Crystal Light, Space Child, some of those songs to me have a very Rolling Stone-ish feel to them. So it makes sense in the context of the time, right? If all you think of, UFO is the Lights Out album, or Strangers in the Night, or MSG stuff, the thought of the Rolling Stones considering him as a replacement for Mick Taylor seems crazy. But in context of that Phenomenon album, to me, it makes total sense why they would be after this guy. Anyways, that never played out. He stuck it out with UFO. And on the Phenomenon tour, they brought in a second guitar player, a guy named Paul Chapman. And Paul Chapman would actually come back later. He was in a group, Skid Row, not the Skid Row that we think of in the US from the 80s, but a British band called Skid Row that I think Gary Moore might have been a member of at one time. I'll have to look into that. Anyways, they brought in this Paul Chapman to play second guitar. And in fact, if you hear the UK recordings, there's some live UK recordings from around the Phenomenon tour, you hear two guitar players, and Paul Chapman's the second guitar player. So he came in for a period there. In 75, Force It came out. And then in 76, No Heavy Petting. And those are great, both great albums. And during this time, they're starting to tour more. They're getting more recognition. Not huge, right? But they were a touring band. They toured a lot. Good stuff off of those albums. 76, they brought in Paul Raymond. Now, Paul Raymond he was in Savoy Brown. He's a left-handed guitar player and keyboard player. Very good at both instruments, by the way, and a great singer and writer. So they brought Paul Raymond in. Those of you that were into Michael Shanker will notice that Paul Raymond was also in the Michael Shanker group for a while. So they've got Paul Raymond, still got Michael Shanker. They put out the Lights Out album, and this was kind of the top. This is at their peak, right? Lights Out comes out, and it's a great album. It has Too Hot to Handle, the song Lights Out, of course, and maybe my favorite UFO song, Love to Love, which is kind of a ballad, kind of a mellow song, but just has a very powerful guitar work is great. The piano's great. It's just a great song. So that comes out. Then Obsession comes out. Typically, when you look at surveys of people, UFO fans, Lights Out and Obsession usually seem to be the two most popular. And of course, the live album, for my money, the best classic rock live album ever made was Strangers in the Night. And that came out in 79, and that was recorded during the Obsession tour. Now, here's where it gets tricky. And I guess these things went on throughout the years. There was always contention between Michael Shanker and Phil Mogg. And Phil Mogg's kind of a scrappy guy. I guess he was a boxer at one point. And he hit Michael Shanker once. And Michael Shanker said, "If you ever hit me again, I'm leaving." And he hit him again, and Michael left. Michael had a habit, and this is similar to the Black Sabbath saga, right? There was too much drinking and substance use happening with UFO. I think that might be the reason that they couldn't quite hold it together enough to climb the mountain, right? I could be wrong, but I assume that's a big part of the problem. Shanker has a history of, I don't know if it was mostly alcohol or something else or both, but he has a history of that sort of thing. And he had a history of being mercurial. Can we say mercurial? Kind of hard to work with. He'd just leave. Okay, he'd get up and leave in the middle of a concert. Could you imagine you're at a concert and halfway through he decides he wants to leave? Or he just leaves before a concert. Well, that happened a few times. And in fact, in the middle of that Strangers tour, in the middle of that tour, he left. You know, fortunately, they got enough recorded during that tour to make the album, but then he leaves. Okay, so then Shanker's out of the picture in about 78. They bring Paul Tonka Chapman back, and they record with George Martin, former Beatles producer George Martin at the helm. They record the album Nowhere to Run, or No Place to Run. And some people cite that as one of their best albums also. And it is a solid album. It's a good album. So what we begin to see around 1980 is kind of a revolving door. Chapman was there for a while. They made some good albums. They had the No Place to Run. They had The Wild, the Willing, and the Innocent, which is another solid album. They had Mechanics. Mechanics, interestingly enough, has Billy Sheehan playing bass. What else? Making Contact comes out, and it kind of becomes a blur at that point. Mechanics, this is my personal opinion I'll throw in here. Mechanics is a good album marred by horns. You know my dislike for horns in hard rock music. And they screwed up some of the songs on that album with horns, which just drives me crazy. But other than that, there's some good stuff. But throughout the 80s, you know, they went through like revolving door guitar players. They brought Atomic Tommy McClendon in, who was just kind of an 80s shredder who just did not fit, among others. And so throughout the 80s, they just were kind of barely treading water. They took a year hiatus in the mid 80s, year or two hiatus, didn't do anything. Well, then mid 90s, guess who comes back? Michael Shanker comes back, and they put out an album called Walk on Water. And guys, this is an excellent album. Excellent album that no one has ever heard. Really good album. They had a few good albums with Shanker. Walk on Water, Sharks, Covenant, all very solid albums that just never got any airplay. But it's good stuff if you can find them. Hard to find them even streaming, but you can find them on YouTube. Listen to the albums on YouTube. Walk on Water especially. Solid album. So Shanker was kind of, from about 95 to about 2003, he was in and out. Again, storming out during concerts, you know, the same type of stuff going on. But they're about from, you know, 95 to about 2003. He's still doing some stuff with the band. 2003, they bring in Vinnie Moore. Remember Vinnie Moore? Instrumental neoclassical guitarist from the mid 80s, really talented guy. And he's stayed with them from 2003 right up until 2019. That was the last tour where Phil Mogg, by the way, the only person that has been there the whole time. Okay. Pete Way was there most of the time. Andy Parker, some of the time. Shanker, some of the time. Paul Raymond, not so much of the time. But the point is, Phil Mogg was the constant. Okay. He was there the whole time. And from 2003 clear up to 2019, Vinnie Moore was there. And Vinnie Moore, he's solid, man. Really good. He can play all eras of the band, all the Shanker stuff, the Paul Chapman stuff, his own stuff. And they've had several good albums. You Are Here from 2004. That was the first one with Vinnie Moore. That's a great album. The Monkey Puzzle. Oh, gosh. Conspiracy of Stars. That was in 2013. That's a really good album. There's a few in there, not mentioning all of them, but one of the great things about the time we live in right now with Spotify and the ability to stream is you can go check out a lot of these albums and decide if they're worth buying. But I'll tell you right now, Walk on Water from 95 is excellent. Covenant's great. Sharks is great. Conspiracy of Stars is great. Those are all worth purchasing. And I see that you can buy a Conspiracy of Stars on vinyl, red vinyl, which is kind of cool. Now, I mentioned that Phil Mogg officially retired, and that's really the end of UFO. And sadly, over the last just over a year, Paul Raymond, Paul Chapman, and most recently Pete Way have all passed away. So for all intents and purposes, UFO is finished, unfortunately. UFO is a phenomenal band. All you got to do is listen. If you're going to start with one album, buy the live album. Get Strangers in the Night. It's my favorite live album. The digital version has about twice as much material as the original album, and I have both. But heck, you might as well just stream it and listen on Spotify, and you'll hear all the extra stuff. And it's just really good stuff. Shanker is phenomenal. He really is. He's definitely, to me, in the top 5 of all time. I mean, you think of the top 5 guitar players, the ones we commonly talk about, right? Shanker's got to be up there. Okay, he's that good. Just his playing, especially when you go back to the mid 70s and think about the time, what he was doing compared to what most other guitar players were doing at the time. Really talented guy. And UFO was a great band. And I know I've talked way too long about this, but that's how passionate I am about UFO. So take a minute, check them out, listen to some of their music, check out the live music. And I think you'll agree that they have not received the recognition that they deserve. And that's a shame. Love to see what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Classic Guitar Rock. Bye-bye.